Hello, in this tutorial we're going to add the ability for the player to fire a missile at the oncoming enemies. So in order to do that, we're going to need to have a new asset. So we have the missile PNG file that you should take and copy into the assets folder of your project, and then of course come in to the assets folder within the development environment, right click on the assets folder and click add files, and then select that missile PNG. So that's going to give us the texture that we're going to need to render that missile onto the screen. Now the next thing we're going to do is need to define a new missile class. Now we could create a new class from scratch, but since this is going to be so similar to an enemy, the enemy's class is responsible for having a position and rendering a texture and moving itself towards the left. The missile is just going to be slightly different from this in changing the texture that's drawn, and instead of moving to the left, the missile should be firing and moving off to the right. So what we can do to save ourselves some time is to right click on the enemy CS. Let's copy that code file and then right click on the Starshooter project and paste that in. That's going to create a copy of this enemy file, and then we can rename that by right clicking on that, and let's call it missile. Okay, so open up the missile class. We need to actually define it as class missile, and we're going to need to change the constructor such that it matches the name of the class itself. We're going to change the graphic that's loaded, so we're not rendering enemy.png, but let's load up missile.png. And the other thing we need to do is the speed doesn't need to come in as a parameter to the constructor. We're just going to set the speed to a constant 5, so it's going to move at a rate of 5 units every frame. And finally, the last thing we'll need to do is change the update function so that the position of the sprite is being increased by the speed, meaning it'll move from the left off to the right. Okay, now that we have our missile class defined, let's go into our app main, and what I'd like to do is maintain a list of missiles. Very similar to our list of enemies that we had here. Let's create another list. This will be a private static list of the missile class that we just defined, and we'll call this the missiles. Okay? And then in our initialize, we'll need to make sure that we create that missiles to be a new list of missile. Make sure that we allocate memory to manage that collection. And what we'd like to do then is every time the player presses the X button or the cross button on the PlayStation Vita, then what we'd like to do is make sure that that missile actually is added onto the screen. So here in our update method of the main program, right down here, after we've updated the enemies, let's say if the gamepad data.buttons, and let's look at gamepad buttons.cross. So we're saying if the cross button is being pressed, or the X button is being pressed, then I want to add a new missile into my missiles collection. So let's say missile M is equal to a new missile, and I'm going to draw it within the local graphics context. I want to position this missile so that it appears just to the right of the middle of the ship. So wherever the player's ship is, I'd like to generate the missile and put it right there. So I'm going to take the ship's X, right wherever the X is, what's the horizontal position of the ship, and I'm going to add to that 115. And the reason I'm adding 115 is that the width of the ship is just about 115 there, so it's going to move all the way to the right of right exactly where the tip of the nose of the ship is. And in the Y position, it's going to be ship.Y, and I'm going to add 30 to that. And the reason for that is that's going to move it about halfway down. The ship's height is about 70, I believe, and the height of the missile is 10. So the middle of the missile is going to be at that middle of the nose of the ship there. Okay, so we're going to create a new missile, and then into my missiles collection, I can add this new missile that I've created. So if you press the X button down, I'm going to create a new missile. I'm going to position it just to the right of the nose of the player's ship, and then I'm going to add it into my missiles collection. Now, not surprisingly, I'm going to need to update all of my missiles and make sure that they move. And just like I handled all the enemies, let's say I want to handle all of the missiles. So let's call this handle missiles function. We haven't written that yet, but it's going to be very similar to handling my enemies. It's going to be a private static void function handle missiles. And I want to iterate across all of the missiles and update themselves. So let's use our for each function. For each missile m in missiles. So for every missile in the missiles collection, I'm going to tell m to update. And what that will do is make sure that all the missiles actually move. Okay? And then finally, I'll also need to render all of the missiles. So for each enemy in the enemies collection, I'll need a for each missiles in the missiles collection. And I'll tell M to render itself, and that'll make sure that the missile is actually drawn to the screen. All right, so let's run this and see what we get. And we have a bit of an error here because the X and the Y that I'm passing in are actually floating point values as part of the ship. So I'll need to typecast those into integers to make sure that I'm passing in the ints as expected by the missile constructor. So the problem that I have is that the X and the Y position of the ship are actually floating point values and are decimal numbers, and I need to convert them into integers before I can pass them into the missile constructor. And the easiest way to do that is to do what's called a typecast. And so it's going to take ship.X and it's going to force it into an integer. I can use parentheses around this data type, and that's going to typecast from a float, in this case, into an integer. And I'll do that for both the X and the Y. And now I'll be able to run this without any kind of type problems. So now let's run this, and that error is gone. And we will get the ships coming in and the player's ship. And if I press the S key, notice that the S is in my simulator, the S is the cross button, and you'll see that I'm getting quite a few missiles that are being fired here. Right, I've got a ton of missiles that are firing because every time I press S, for every frame it's checking to see, am I pressing the X button or the S button in the simulation. And that's really not what we want. I mean, this would be kind of an unfair game to have this many missiles to come out. So what we need to do is to change it to where I'm only allowed to fire every so often. But before I do that, it might be interesting to actually display how many missiles are actually on the screen at any given time. So let's go into our HUD, and like we did with the enemies, I'd like to add a label. I'll call this missiles. And that label is going to be used to track how many missiles are on the screen. So since it's so similar to my enemies label that I had, I'm just going to cut and paste that. It's called missiles, so I'll use that here. And I'll just replace my, every time where you saw enemies, I'll just say add the missiles, and it needs to be at a slightly different Y position, so I'm going to move it down just a little bit, and so you'll see the enemy count and then the missile count will be directly below that. And obviously I need to change the text so that it says missile count, and I'll also need to add and update missile count. So let's, again, very similar to updating the enemy's count, I'm going to say copy and paste this, and we'll call it update missile count. And then we'll just say whatever count that you pass into me is going to be what I display in the missiles text. I'm going to say the missile count equals whatever this is. Okay, so now I have a new public variable. I have a new public method here, and I can pass in this count and I'll update the text. Okay, I'll also have this new label that shows up. So in my app main, whenever I do an update, not only do I want to update the enemy count, but let's tell the HUD to update the missile count as well. So missiles is my collection, and count is going to tell me how many missiles that I have. So now if I run this, what we'll get is as I fire, you can see that my missile count is really quite huge. I've got almost 200 missiles here in just a few seconds of playing the game. And you'll also notice that the missile count keeps going up. Even though the missiles are going off to the right of the screen, I'm not removing them. So we'll have to do a bit of cleanup like we did with the enemies collection, that when the missiles move off the right of the screen, we need to remove them from our collection. So we got a little bit more work here, but you can see that I can process the user pressing the X button, and it's going to handle the user, the missile being created in the world there. So just like we did with the enemies, when we were handling the enemies, we need to test to see if the missiles have gone off the right of the screen. So I'm going to create a for loop in my handle missiles function. And just like we did with the enemies collection, I'm going to start at the end, and I'm going to move to the beginning, and I want to see, is the missile too far off to the right of the screen? So for int I equals missiles.count -1. So starting all the way at the end of this missiles collection, what I'd like to do then is keep going so long as I is greater than or equal to 0. That's our conditional test. So long as I is at least 0, I'm going to continue this, and I'm going to decrement I each time through this loop. Okay, now the work here is to see if the missiles at position I, its X position is greater than the width of the screen. Right? So here's our width of our graphics context, and if the X position of the ith missile is off the right, meaning I can't see it anymore, then I'm just simply going to remove at position I from the missiles collection. So every time you tell me to handle the missiles, not only am I going to move them, but then I'm going to see, do they need to be removed from the collection? So let's run this now, and you should be able to see I can fire these missiles, but as they're going off the screen, you see the missile count is going down because I am removing them from that collection. So I've got quite a bit of missiles that I can fire, but as they go off the edge of the right-hand edge of the screen, they're going to be removed from that collection, just like as the enemies are moving off the left-hand side of the screen, and if they're not visible anymore, I'm going to remove them from that collection. Now really the last thing I need to do to improve this is to make it a bit fair to the enemies and not allow me to have hundreds of missiles firing at the same time. And in order to fix that, I'm going to go into my update method and say, look, if you're pressing the button down, the shooting button down, then what I want to do is see if enough time has passed to where it's fair for you to actually deal with this. So if you're pressing the X button down, I want to handle shooting here. And the handle shooting is going to be a function that I write, and then I'm going to have the logic that makes sure it's fair to shoot a new missile or not inside of this handle shooting function. So let's create a new private static void function called handle shooting. It takes in no parameters here, and this code about generating a new missile and adding it into the missiles collection, I'm going to take out of the update function and put it into my handle shooting function. And I'm going to add a little bit of logic to see, is enough time gone by to where I should actually make this shot. Now I'm going to do this just like I did with the enemy creation. Notice that when I was handling the enemies, I wanted to see if enough time had passed. I'm going to do the same thing, but instead of having an enemy time counter, I'm going to keep track of a shooting time counter to see, has enough time passed since the last time you shot a missile. In order to do that, I'm going to create a new variable here. Right up at the top within my app main class. It's going to be a static long, we'll call it shooting time counter. And in my initialize, just like I set the enemy time counter to be 0, I'm going to set my shooting time counter to be equal to 0 as well. So I want to keep track of how much time has passed since the last time you shot. So in the handle shooting, I'm going to say that the shooting time counter is going to go up by the delta time, right, or time delta that we have here. And remember, time delta is how much time has passed since the last time we ran update. So here I'm going to increment my shooting time counter by this amount, and I'm going to then see has enough time passed. But notice that I'm only going to count handle shooting if the X button is pressed. So let's actually take that out of the handle shooting and put it up here into the update, because I always want to update how much time has passed since you shot here. I'm going to say the shooting time counter should be increased by time delta here in the update, and if you're then pressing the cross button, I want to handle the shooting. Okay, so easy enough. Now what I need to do is then say, within the handle shooting, I know that you're pressing the X button, so I just need to know now, has enough time passed? So let's look at the shooting time counter and see if it's equal at least to, let's say, half a second. Okay? And we're going to say, if at least half a second has gone by, Then you can create a new missile and add it in, but I need to also make sure I reset my shooting time counter down to 0. Okay, so the logic is, in the update, I'm going to advance my shooting time counter by how much time has passed. I'm then going to see if you're pressing the cross button, and if you are, I'm going to run this handle shooting function. The handle shooting function is going to say, has enough time passed, and if so, reset the time, and then create a new missile. And what we'll get now if we run this is, if I press the X button down, I'm only getting a missile every half second, so two missiles per second. And that makes it a bit more fair. You can adjust the time here. Right? I could say I only want to shoot every second, just by changing the conditional expression here when the shooting time counter is greater than or equal to 1,000 milliseconds. And now if I run this, what we'll get is, holding down the cross button, I get 1 missile per second. Okay, so you can change how your game plays just by adjusting how often you're able to shoot. Let's say I wanted to shoot 10 bullets a second or 10 missiles a second, then only do it every 100 milliseconds. And if we run this now, you'll see that we get quite a few bullets coming out. It's not as much as we had before, right? Because that was every frame I was able to generate a new missile. But here, this is probably a little unfair to the enemies, but I can shoot 10 missiles per second if I'd like. Let's change that back to 2 missiles per second. I think that's a good balance there for this game that we're building. So to review what we've done here, we created a new missile class, and the missile loads this missile PNG, which was a new asset we brought in here. Right? Every time we tell a missile to update, it's going to move itself to the right. And then inside of our main application, we created a new list of missiles. And every time you press the X button down or the cross button down, it's going to add a new missile into the missiles collection. Of course, we needed to handle the missiles, so that means we need to tell each one of the missiles to update and also check to see if it's moved too far to the right. And if it's off screen, then we want to remove it from that collection. And the last thing we did was make sure that it was a bit fair for the player to not be able to shoot too much. So we've got this notion of a shooting time counter, that we're going to increase that by how much time has passed, and if enough time has passed, then that's when I'll be able to actually create the missile. So we can adjust how many missiles are fired every second. Now, right now the missiles aren't actually hitting the enemies, and they're not being removed from the screen, so we'll do that in the next tutorial.